a few words about our next session, which has a very easy to remember title, Poke, exclamation mark, which seems to have been something that people were quite happy to do on Facebook a number of years ago. And then it became, it seemed to become quite vulgar. And I think the whole phenomenon of poking seems to have been taken off the Facebook. It seemed to belong to the kind of foundational frat boy period of Facebook. And it's kind of interesting that as Facebook kind of had to grow up and defratify itself, that the whole notion of poking, which takes on obviously different sort of politics between genders. I certainly had different reactions if I poked a male friend, if I poked a female friend. What Turi and Joumana are about to be talking about, or looking at, are some of these questions. So, how do you tell a story when today is an addicted, meme-themed timehole of all things new? Are our lives feeling less like stories, and therefore our hunger for stories grow with every Google server farm across the planet? And does data reach a terrifying size beyond which it either leaves us behind, or does it force us to tame this data deluge back into stories that we can understand and relate to? So to explore this, we're deeply grateful and honored to have Joumana Al Jabri, who's co-founder and co-director of Visualizing Impact, and she'll be in conversation with our co-director of the Global Art Forum this year, Turi Munthe. Will you please welcome Turi and Joumana? Thank you.
Thanks, Shimon. And thank you, Joumana. You've just complicated poking. How is that doable? The genesis of this conversation is a feeling that I think both of us share, and a lot of people share, that a bit like the poke lost in the ether, the only symbol of any kind of interaction between two people, there's an enormous amount of information floating about which does not hang intelligently on any kind of information architecture. It has no frame. And one of the things which has interested me so much about visualizing impact is this: it doesn't just start from that premise and say we need to tell stories. It says we need to tell stories in completely different ways. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us a little bit about what visualizing impact is?
Okay. I'll, instead of giving just a general presentation or information about visualizing impact and visualizing Palestine in particular, I'm going to start with an example of what we do and what we try to achieve through the work we do. So there's a lot of information out there. Many different people are trying different ways to get to report that information through different means. We, on a very basic level, we use design and technology to relay data and facts about social issues. But where I'm going to start is actually, this was even pre-visualizing Palestine, where I was preparing for the marathon in Dubai, and also a friend of mine was running the marathon in Gaza. I'm an architect by origin, and I found that actually overlaying Gaza and Dubai, they're exactly the same on an urban level. So all of this political talk and humanitarian talk and all of that, on a very, very fundamental level, if you run from north to south of Gaza, that's a marathon run. So 3 hours or up to 5 hours for the amateur runner. This is Gaza. This is the prison that some people are living in. And for us to really understand it, living in the Gulf, this is one of the comparisons. It's an older comparison, so ignore the numbers on the left. On the right, it's overlaying the Palm Island in Dubai and Gaza, and particularly looking at this darker shaded zone where that's the limit of where fishermen can fish. So any point after that point is actually a fisherman is almost guaranteed to be shot at. So today, the perspective of going to Atlantis at the end of the Palm Island is very different for me, where I start understanding what happens to a fisherman in Gaza. And this is what we're talking about when we say, okay, how do we actually shift the way information is displayed? What types of comparisons do we actually make? This is, everyone talks about Gaza under siege and so on, but no one really talks about the distance, basic distance between Gaza and the closest point in the West Bank. Why has no one been talking about this? This is actually exactly the distance. The nearest point is the distance. If I were to take the metros, the Red Line in Dubai, that's from where I live to where my sister lives. This is how close some families have not seen members of the family for 6 years at a distance of 50 kilometers. And you know, you can talk about everything that happens in the news, but honestly, I barely watch the news, and the news don't affect me on a personal level. This affects me on a personal level. Today, when I take the metro, I think 5 times about the families in Gaza in a different way than a news report. Another thing in terms of overlapping information that's not spoken about in the news, and Turi, maybe as a journalist, you can tell me why they're not spoken about. For instance, the yellow line here is the what Israel calls the security wall, the separation wall. And all we did was we took the separation wall that claims to bring more security to Israelis and overlay a completely different infrastructure, which is the bus system, taking Israelis from Jerusalem into the settlements, into the West Bank. So on the one hand, Israel, you build the wall to keep security on your land and for your people, which in all cases is anyway not accurate because it divides between Palestinians. But let's take that for a fact. And then you bring in an entire bus system that actually brings your people to the so-called terrorist area. So it's very simple. You know, there's nothing to do an uprising about if you only bring 2 types of information that actually contradict each other from the same source. And then to create relevance to people. So why should a New York-based person really care at all or understand what it means that olive trees are being uprooted in the West, in Palestine? 800,000 trees have been uprooted in Palestine since '67. So this actually, we called up 5 different parks around the world and tried to compare number of trees. We have those numbers for France, for a park in China, I think, and so on. And it actually turns out that the 800,000 trees means 33 times the Central Park uprooted. So suddenly this becomes understandable to someone based in New York or someone globally because, you know, they understand Central Park more than they would understand uprooting of trees. Maybe you can go ahead with this one, Turi. I know it's one of your liked ones.
I love the fact that you have to scroll to find Kenya, which has the salary of politicians 97 times the mean salary in the country. I think what strikes me so much about this is, 1, it's a very beautiful image. 2, it's, you know, it performs something that we see everywhere, the sort of the shanty town and the beautiful high-rises. But 3, it renders what you're trying to say so very quickly. I ask all my friends who are in the news business whether they have ever scrolled to the bottom of any article ever on their phone that they look at a news app, and never has the answer ever been yes. There's a huge amount of wasted intellectual effort. There's a huge amount of wasted time and money and work being put into information formats which have no impact anymore because nobody's going to the bottom of them. So when faced with this deluge of data, we need to frame it in a way which is going to have an impact. I increasingly turn to visualizations. There's a very funny book called Moonwalking with Einstein, and the title, in fact, sort of explains what it does. It's a book about memory and how memory is fixed. And this is a story of somebody who tried to become the American memory champion. And how memory works when you're learning how to do it is that you associate facts with very, very peculiar other things. So if you want to remember the number 8, you imagine, I don't know, 2 large, something, hell knows. It seems to me what you're doing is an enormous amount of this. It's somehow about fixing information in a way which is really memorable and really impactful.
Yeah, I think, and we discussed this maybe this morning, for it to be memorable, it's a fine line. This is part of an art event, but there's a fine line between finding something attractive and for something to be actually impactful. So one of the things that we're very focused on in our team is actually the storytelling aspect of the work, more so than the visualization, although the end medium is so far very much a visualization. So how can you, our measure of whether our work has been successful or not is, can you extract a one-liner that you would include at a dinner without the visual and actually be excited enough or aha moment enough for you to transfer it to another person beyond the visual itself. So the visual can be dropped out as long as the story stays in mind. And one of the tests also that I personally like is actually a friend who's blind to run the visuals by her and tell her, is this story effective? So really not to be fooled by visualization. Our brand name is visualizing something, but we're very far from just focusing on visualization and more memory and storytelling. And how can it be carried into the way you think, into the way you behave about other issues as well, and not just say, great, I understand this issue, and it's an intellectual exercise.
You just talked about an aha moment. Mm-hmm. Is that your job, creating aha moments?
Maybe aha is not the right one. Shock factor. Just like I spoke about Dubai and Gaza, to me it's how on earth did I not know about this? How on earth am I living in the Arab region and growing up, all I hear about is whether a Muslim should marry a Christian, and I'd never heard about whether that a Palestinian of the same religion cannot marry a Palestinian of the same religion. This is shocking. We're living in a world that's completely skewed our priorities. So bringing out almost disappointments in ourselves of how could I not have known that?
With the bus routes against the wall, you're sort of demonstrating hypocrisy, but it's demonstrating rather than telling, which is, I think, what's so impactful about it. With the Dubai v. Gaza, it's as impactful as it is, seems to me, because you've just thrown two absurd stereotypes against each other and made both stick in some fascinating way. With the trees in Central Park, you're rendering it personal too. You're rendering a very local disaster personal to millions and millions of people who will never have that personal experience for it. I kind of think of the job of media today as surprise. It's about somehow sucking out an emotional response. An emotional, perhaps maybe it's a chemical, maybe it's biochemical, maybe it's the dopamine thing that we were talking about earlier. A dopamine response from people, because that's the only thing which is going to anchor ideas for that dinner party.
Yeah, and maybe I'll use the term cognitive dissonance. How do you eventually, I'm reading a lot about the brain and the way neurons function. So for this to be actually effective, on the one hand, we can reach the tipping point like the uprising in Egypt, but then today look at where we are in terms of Egypt. So how can you not only realize it at that moment when there's a hype, but actually for the brain to be entirely rewired to think in a certain way? I don't know if that touches on what you're talking about, but that's...
It does, and perhaps this is a nice time to ask you about how your own creative processes work. This isn't just something that you're pitching and hoping will work. This is a practice bred out of your own very personal experience, isn't it?
So there's both. Maybe I'll touch on the process of our team and a bit about what I particularly am interested in. So in terms of a team, we're a multidisciplinary team working all the way from ideation, research, storytelling. Storytelling is the hiccup within the team because every person perceives a story or the strength of the story differently, and it's quite challenging to to eventually not settle, but actually have one type of mindset lead a certain visual in a certain direction. And then we visualize, but a lot of the work is actually produced in collaboration with entities outside of our team. So many people approach us to actually visualize things for them, and we tell them most 90% of the work that we have produced hasn't actually been produced visually in-house. It's been through partnerships. So that's one thing. In terms of how we work and maybe bringing psychology into it, I think there's in the way businesses are working today, it's you have to work in speed, you have to churn out content and just produce. A lot of what we're trying to look at is how can we give ourselves, while catching up or working with the speed and necessity for this information, how can we actually also have periods where we're looking back at things? And this is where the concept of, here I'm going into creative processes. What can we be inspired by? And do we just get information out and do more of what's out there, but just in different formats? Or can we actually start learning from nature? In nature, there's a concept now in management thinking and design thinking that's called biomimicry. How can you start learning from what's around you to actually eventually make something effective? So I wonder if biomimicry was involved or preceded the uprising in Egypt, maybe some more positive outcome would have lasted today. So biomimicry is a way of looking at how the pace of things and in nature, which makes it that as human beings we're very excited about the tipping point, but then we don't really think enough about what happens afterwards, and it's the afterwards that's going to instill the sense of social justice or whatever else. It's not enough to be excited about the million clicks on a YouTube video, because it doesn't mean that social justice has been implemented. So part of what we're looking at internally in the team is how to not be carried away by the hype, and to really try and understand what it means to have lasting change. How can the human beings within our team, even at the scale of our team, and not the 100,000 followers, actually change after having worked with us? And the designer who just left our team to set up her own company came back to me and told me, I'm now part of VI. I am part of VI, although I have left VI. So this is really what we're trying to achieve, that people, eventually we don't care about the brand, we care about how are people who are touching or being in touch with the work that we do actually changing fundamentally, and not just writing an article or having a discussion at dinner.
So, translating it back in my terms, it sounds like the work that you've done looking at the signs around us, the data that is pulled in by journalists who you are frustrated by, rightly, in the way that they cover world news, but also the kind of things that human beings get excited about actually in practice, in whether it's revolutions or whether it's click-through rates, they're kind of the wrong signs. And it sounds like that, looking at that as clearly as you are, and looking at it from a very active perspective insofar as you are trying to change things, you are activists, you are not pure media reporters. It sounds like you've internalized that practice as well. It sounds like being part of VI is almost like some kind of mystical process. I mean, it sounds like you are, what is that process? Are you emptying yourselves of this wrong thinking to be able to better ask questions? How does that work? Because I know that this personal journey for you is also very important.
Yeah, so I hope, I don't know that anyone in the team would speak about it in the same way that I'm speaking about it, but we're bringing in, there's a tendency to want to become, to churn out products. And that's a natural tendency. Designers want to, see designs. One of the things we're instilling within the team is actually to have to have almost types of sessions that are usually used in healing and therapy and just very far from the world of production. And we're trying to bring those into our process and teamwork. And you spoke about collaboration, Hassa, ahead of me. And how do we understand things by also feeling them? It's a very conceptual world.
Let's drill down. You're doing this for a purpose. You're doing this because it helps you better understand how other people will respond to the work that you're doing?
We're doing it on a first level to make sure that the people working on it treat it as more than just an intellectual exercise, where it's really, if for example, within a team, you don't acknowledge that there may be even conflict in producing the work, and you're speaking about conflict, in the world, then there's a disconnect, and what you're producing is an image of justice and peace and all of that, but eventually you're not attentive to the team itself that could light into fires and war if left to conflict internally. But usually companies treat it as let's have conflict in-house, and keep it and have the better image and speak about social justice outside. So what we're thinking about also is how do you bring differently opinionated people within the team to collaborate? And separate from visualization, that's a model that I believe is worth looking at to eventually create fundamental peaceful environments, and not just people who talk about peace but not apply it within their teams. I don't know. I think many people avoid speaking about how collaboration happens inside, and avoid seeing the links between what happens in a company and where we're at in the world today in terms of conflict. Where everyone's opinionated, everyone has different, approaches to things, and it's kept too closed.
I'm struck how collaboration has been a repeat theme of today and very much of yesterday as well. And I also couldn't agree more with you that the way that companies work mirrors sometimes not very nicely society at large. Most companies that I've seen work are autocratic feudal systems. They're very ugly, and actually that's most people's experience of a polity is actually the company in which they work, and they're horrible for the most part. So the fact that you should be doing this as a reflection of the work that you're doing elsewhere, I think is fascinating. And I think, as you say, when you talk about visualization, it's only one part of what you're doing. When you become the global well-being, the global company trainer, you'll be having just as much impact. We've got just a couple of minutes left. You've brought up companies and the structures of companies. I know that you want visualizing impact to become a for-profit company. And part of the conversation yesterday...
I'd be careful with the for-profit. A company, yes, not necessarily for-profit.
Sorry, but a company.
A company structure.
Which no longer needs to necessarily rely on on grants, on the not-for-profit sector. Mm-hmm. Why?
It's in the region. There's a lot of let's let economy move in a certain direction, and let the good doers do their job, and we'll make sure to raise the funds through those businesses, and then bring them back into humanitarian work and social justice work. But keep doing your job. I'm not. I went to a certain university. I came back because I want to be a professional within the world that I'm working in, design world. I'm working with other people from different fields, and our first level passion is, along with social justice, is also to advance the fields we're working in. And if we separate social issues from business, then what we're doing is saying, okay, business cannot succeed if it touches or goes anywhere near social issues. One of our goals is actually to prove that you can stand on your feet as a business, having started with social issues, not resulting in CSR that eventually puts some of its profit on social issues. So it's to us, it's not. It's logical that a business should address a social issue and should stand on its feet because there should be demand for social issues being addressed.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, you're saying that because there is a sort of charity sector, it's pushed onto the margins. It's conceived of as being on the margins with its money coming from business, which doesn't need to adhere to the fundamental principles that charity would like to, or the not-for-profit sector would like to push.
And specifically in the context of Palestine, that it's become a numb society economically and not trained anymore. Youth are not trained anymore to find ways to actually to stand on their feet, independent from funding coming from outside sources.
Before I open it up to the public, I have to ask you what we can learn from bears.
So bears is a personal, it's a personal inspiration. That's part of the route of going into biomimicry. And bears have cycles, I believe, of 6 months. So 6 months high activity and then 6 months hibernation. And again, in a world that's very speedy, competitive, always trying to think of how to produce more, there isn't time for reflection. And on a personal level, last December, for instance, I quieted down, closed on anything to do with production and said, okay, we're dismissing, we can't move forward if we don't slow down. And many different insects, animals, and so on have different paces, different things to learn from. Bears in particular, for me, is just a big hit that there's a strong animal. It can be that strong, but it can also hibernate. And so the importance of not falling into the pressures of this, we haven't seen a visual yet from you in 6 months. Why is that? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative thing. So it's just, thank you.
Do we have any questions?
My question is, part of my work is related to photography, and this kind of reminded me a bit of documentary photography and photojournalism, because it was a way of kind of getting the message across maybe in a more direct way and kind of achieving this shock factor that you talked about. And now you talk about the sort of fatigue of the viewer, and kind of it doesn't have the effect that it intended to have at the beginning. And I was wondering whether you're also running into the same kinds of concerns, or that they are. Turi used the word beautiful image at one point, and I was. They are beautiful images, and they're produced by professionals. They're produced by people who know about design, who know about, kind of attracting. It's also a seductive kind of, strategy in a way. So I was wondering how you kind of deal with those questions, how you think about those issues, thinking ahead of you talked about, whether you should continue producing in the same way, and whether, there's a way of reaching that point where you can't have the same impact anymore.
Absolutely. When we started, the premise of our work is to say we have a certain diverse skill set, and we're going to keep on revising how we use those skill sets. So infographics, we've been working on them for 3 years, and now we're more and more doing digital work, tech-based work. And so we're not bound by that output that we are now known for. And so that's a very different approach from, let's say, a design company that specializes, and that's actually why I left architecture, is that as an architect, I'm meant to build buildings. But guess what? If buildings are actually harming our cities in the way that we're building them, should I not have enough flexibility to shift to another output? But I'm stuck because I'm labeled an architect. So we're trying not to be labeled infographics producers. We are a group of people with a diverse skill set trying to find solutions that should be continuously adaptable to whatever will be effective, and ask ourselves, is it effective or not, and shift. But obviously, it's very demanding because you learn a way of doing something, and then now you have to shift to something else. So even in terms of practical costs, it's extremely difficult.
Joumana, thank you very, very much indeed, and for keeping the time. It was fascinating.